Firstly, let's focus on transitions. What are transitions? You don't have to remember these names, by the way. We simply add them here in the hopes that it is clearer for you to distinguish between the three of them. For example, however is a transition. So I'm not talking about meaning. I am talking about the type of linking word that this is in a grammatical sense. We'll use however as an example. So firstly, a transition, you should remember that this is used to move from one sentence to the next or one paragraph to the next. However, you can see is about something that came before, right? It contrasts this information with what you mentioned before. So you move from one sentence to a new sentence. Secondly, it adds meaning to a sentence, but it's not grammatically necessary. Imagine that we delete however. The sentence would still be grammatically accurate, right? It would read, the information in the resumes would contradict this concern. That's a perfectly perfect sentence. If we add however, we are adding meaning, but it's not grammatically necessary. The sentence works without the word. But of course, we want to add it to be able to add this new sense of contrast. Thirdly, it modifies an entire sentence. These two are very much linked. You can see that however belongs to this entire sentence, right? Usually comes at the beginning of a sentence. We say usually, not always. For example, here I could say the information in the resumes, comma, however, comma, would contradict this concern. You can see the use of commas as well. This is an indication of this feature. Why should you add a comma before and after however if you use it in the middle of a sentence? Because it is not grammatically necessary. You simply add meaning. In English, that means you have to add commas to separate it from your sentence. That's why here it says it's usually followed by a comma. Of course, if it comes at the beginning of a sentence, you only add a comma after it. And these are very useful in speech, but they're more common in writing. So far, so good. Let's look at a few other examples. You've already seen, however, let's consider others. This is not an exhaustive list. I'm sure that other linking words that are transitions exist. But I think if you keep this list at hand, you will have plenty of alternatives to use in the texts that you will be asked to write. So let's turn to the second type of linking word. These are called conjunctions. Again, let's start by looking at the example here. Because is a conjunction in English. It says, because these resumes had equivalent Canadian education and experience, this finding can be considered a measure of the extent of racial discrimination in the process of granting interviews. Now let's look at characteristics. So firstly, conjunctions join clauses together in one sentence. If you think back to however, it was used to move from one sentence to another. The sentence with however in it contrasted with a sentence, a separate sentence that came before it, right? So you were linking across two separate sentences, you could say. A conjunction does that within one and the same sentence. Because here outlines the reason for why this finding can be considered a measure and so on. You can see it provides a reason for what is in that very sentence. Grammatically speaking, that is a crucial difference between transitions and conjunctions. Right? You can see here, transitions don't do this. You can't add however, blah, 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 comma, and a new sentence. That's not how a transition works. You would have to add a full stop. Okay, now, let's look at this in more detail. The conjunction introduces what in grammar is called a dependent clause. And a dependent clause must always be attached to what in grammar you call an independent clause. Now let's look at an example. Here, the dependent clause is underlined and the independent clause is added in italics. Now, how do you know if a clause is dependent or independent? Well, remember that for transitions, for however, we said, well, if you take out however, your sentence is still grammatically accurate, right? Here, that's not true. If you take out because, your sentence is not grammatically accurate. If we say, these resumes with Asian names had equivalent Canadian education and experience, comma, this finding can be considered. That's not the way the sentence should work. Now, again, to get back to that dependent clause, how do you know that this part is dependent? Well, a dependent clause must be attached to an independent clause. Why? Because a dependent clause on its own is not a full sentence. If I were to delete everything in italics here, then this sentence on its own would be a grammatical error. You can't say, because these results with Asian names had equivalent Canadian education and experience, full stop. That's not a sentence. Because you have to explain what you're giving the reason of within that same sentence. You have to add a comma and add what is here called an independent clause. Why is this an independent clause? Because unlike a dependent clause, technically speaking, this could be a sentence on its own. If you were to write, this finding can be considered as a measure of the extent of racial discrimination in the process of granting interviews. That's perfectly fine. That's a grammatically accurate sentence. Whereas for the dependent clause, you can't do that. The word because prevents you from doing that. Okay. Let's look at a few examples. You can see here you have conjunctions for time, for place, also for reason, that was because, also for contrast. So different types of linking words can have the same meaning. Here, this one, of course, these ones have the same meaning as however, which is a transition, right? But it has the same meaning as though, even though, and although, or while. So the meaning is not what is relevant in making these distinctions, these categories. What is relevant is how you use them grammatically speaking. Have a look at example sentence for while, for example. Here you see, while my childhood was calm, my adult life is very stressful. And again, you can see that comma in the middle. You can see that for all of these examples, or most of them. Here for where you don't need it, you shouldn't use it, neither for so that. In the other examples, you can see that comma. This is a very clear indication that you're using a conjunction. So this is perfectly accurate. Okay? While my childhood was calm, this is contrasted to your adult life. Let's say that I wanted to use however here. I would have to change my sentence considerably. I would have to say, for example, my adult life is very stressful, full stop. However, comma, my childhood was calm. Do you see that the meaning is the same, but what I write is completely different? This is why it's so important to study these separately. So you know what the conjunctions are, you know what the transitions are, and you know how to use them accurately. Let's have a look at the final category of linking words. And this one is a little easier in a way. It presents other challenges. The final category is one of prepositions. Technically, it's not only the preposition that is the linking word, it's actually the entire phrase. So after preposition, you'll have a noun. Again, it's easiest to look at the example to know what I'm talking about. The example that I'm using is because of. This is the prepositional phrase. And the sentence reads, the loss of a handful of email messages because of a technical glitch is an irritation. Now let's have a closer look. This is the prepositional phrase that I'm talking about here. It is the linking phrase plus what you can call its object. This is a noun, een zelfstandig naamwoord. That's the only thing that can come after a preposition. Everything else is just a sentence in which this added meaning is put. And here you can see that a preposition joins a phrase to a sentence. A technical glitch, or because of a technical glitch, can never be a sentence on its own. It's just a phrase, just a few words. There is no verb here, for example. That's why, like conjunctions, but unlike transitions, they have an essential grammatical function. They are really part of your sentence. In the next slide, I'm going to show you a short list of useful prepositions that can be used as linking words. I'm going to show you those which have similar meanings as the conjunctions and transitions that I've already shared with you. Let's have a closer look. Here are a few examples. There are even some linking words that are in different categories. Do you remember, for example, was also in the transitions table? Now, what's the difference? Let me show you that in more detail. For example, and for instance, were both in the transitions and the prepositions category. Why? Because you can use them in different ways. Compare these two sentences. You can say, I've always been interested in sports, full stop. Start a new sentence. For instance, comma, used as a transition. I play soccer and basketball. But you could also use it as a preposition. I play many sports, comma, for instance, soccer. Here you only add one noun and you add a comma. Here you add a comma after the linking word and then you add a full sentence. Right? Subject, verb, and object. See the difference? In this video, I'm going to share a summary of what to remember when it comes to linking words. Firstly, there are two aspects that you need to consider. There is meaning on the one hand, and there is sentence structure on the other. So let's tackle meaning first. As you know, you can convey quite a few meanings using linking words. For example, say contrast. And let's use a second example, namely reason. And I'm sure that you can come up with quite a few examples with linking words that convey the meaning of contrast and reason. Let me give you a few examples here. Let's say there is however, I can think of although, or for example, despite. Let's do the same for reason. A few examples would be for that reason, there is because, and there is, for example, because of. So why do you have to consider meaning? Well, for the obvious reason that, of course, if you're trying to convey contrast, then you should use one of these words. You wouldn't use because when you're actually trying to convey contrast, because you know that because conveys the meaning of reason. So that's the first consideration that you have to make. Make sure that you choose a linking word in writing that fits the meaning that you're trying to convey. So far, so good. What is more tricky is sentence structure. So let's focus on that in a little more detail. Sentence structure is not about meaning. So that's the first step that you have to go through. But the second step is, once you know which meaning you're trying to convey, now you have to think of the type of sentence that you want to write. And here is where the three main categories of linking words that we've taught you come into play. There were three categories. Right? You had transitions, subordinators, and prepositions. And here you can see that I have already added them in those categories. However, and for that reason, our transitions, although and because, are subordinators, and despite and because of our prepositions. So now let's look at how the sentence structure would change depending on the type of linking word you would choose. So let's say you're trying to convey contrast. And the type of sentence that I'm writing looks as follows. I have my linking word in the beginning, and I want to add one full sentence. So this is my linking word, and this would then be an independent clause, one complete thought that I'm trying to convey. For example, I've mentioned that the circumstances are rather difficult now for students to study, but I want to say that, well, no matter that, in contrast to that, I want to say that the students did study very hard. So if I want to use this structure, that means that before this, I would have mentioned that the circumstances are fairly difficult. And here I want to say the students have studied hard. And with that linking word, I want to convey contrast. So how could I do that? For example, I could say, however, the students have studied hard. However, as I mentioned above, is a transition. And it's transitions that can do this. They contrast, in this case, with a sentence that came before, and in a new sentence, they convey the sense of contrast. However, and then add whatever contrasts with the sentence before. But this is expressed in two separate sentences. That's what transitions do. So in other words, here I would not be able to use although the students have studied hard. I would not be able to use despite the students have studied hard. Even though they share the same meaning, they can't be used in the same type of sentence. Now, this doesn't mean that this is the only a sentence can look when you use transitions. Many transitions, like however, can also appear in the middle of a sentence. For example, I could also add however here. I could say the students, comma, however, comma, have studied hard. So know that transitions don't always have to come in the beginning of a sentence, but they should always belong to one independent sentence. That does not change. Okay, now let's have a look at a second type of sentence. Let's say that I want to convey this meaning of the circumstances being difficult and the students studying hard. That contrast, I want to convey that in one and the same sentence. So, for example, let's say I want to say that although, let's say it was difficult Let me stick to a short sentence so it will fit. The students studied hard. You can see the sentence structure is different. Here we have our linking word to start with. So far it's the same. But then here we have what appears to be a sentence. It was difficult. We have a comma, and we have another sentence. The students studied hard. Whatever follows the linking word is your dependent clause. Remember that this is an incomplete thought. What follows after the comma is your independent clause, the complete thought. If I said, although it was difficult, you can feel that something's missing. That makes it an incomplete thought. Whereas when I say the students studied hard, this is a complete thought. It expresses what I'm trying to say. So the linking word is joined with the dependent clause, comma, and the independent clause. And although here is our linking word, and as I mentioned here, although is a subordinator, and this is how subordinators work. They join dependent clauses to independent clauses. When the linking word and dependent clause comes in the beginning of the sentence, it is usually followed, not to say always, actually followed by a comma, but you can also swap the order. So if you want, the other way that this sentence could look is the independent clause coming first, and the dependent clause following, of course, first with our linking word, and then our dependent clause. And here a comma is not always added, but sometimes it is. So the sentence would read, the students studied hard, comma, although it was difficult, full stop. So that's type number 2. Let's consider the third type, namely prepositions. When it comes to prepositions, we're not talking about two sentences, but we're talking about one independent clause and in this independent clause, you will find your linking word, and that linking word is followed not by a sentence, but by a noun phrase. What is a noun phrase? The easiest way to explain it is it doesn't have a verb. So there's no verb here. There are only nouns there. For example, adjectives, but never a verb. So let me give you an example here as well. The students studied hard despite the circumstances. So here, despite is our linking word, and you can see it is followed by just an article and a noun. And here we have our independent clause, our main thought, our complete thought in this case. So again, I've conveyed the same meaning. However, the students have studied hard with the circumstances are difficult coming before that in a separate sentence. Although it was difficult, the students studied hard. The students studied hard despite the circumstances. I've conveyed contrast 3 times, and I've conveyed the same meaning 3 times, but I've used different sentence structures to do that. So why are these 3 categories so important? To ensure that, for example, you never add a full sentence after prepositions, only a noun phrase. So if you know which linking words are prepositions, then you know which sentences to check to make sure that only noun phrases follow these words. For the subordinators, what should you check? That you don't separate your dependent clause for your independent clause using a full stop. If I were to add a full stop here, write a linking word, my dependent clause full stop and my independent clause separately, that is a mistake. I have to use a comma. I can't separate these two because subordinators link a dependent clause to an independent clause. Even in terms of punctuation, a full stop would separate them. Where is a full stop? Here, with transitions. With a transition, you separate one part of your contrast from the other. The circumstances were difficult, full stop. However, comma, the students have studied hard. So when you know that although is a subordinator, then you know there need to be both a dependent clause and independent clause. You know that however is a transition, so you know only one type of sentence can follow it, namely independent clauses. One or two independent clauses if there is another linking word such as and in between. That's all fine because they belong to independent clauses. So those are the main rules to remember. Good luck.